I really appreciate you're all taking the time to come out here for the final talk on alleged contradictions in the Gospels, part 2. As before, I'd like to start this one with a quotation from 2 Peter 3:16. There are some things in them, Peter's referring to the epistles of Paul here, that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction as they do the other scriptures. Once again tonight, we will see an example of someone attempting to take the scriptures in ways that they were not intended to be taken, or to make believe that they say things that they don't say. And once you do that, you're looking for trouble. And if you're looking for trouble, you'll find it. But in this lecture, we're going to examine very carefully what the scriptures actually say and not rest content to take someone else's word for it. We've been using this map of the material as we've been going along, and at this point, having covered the positive external evidence, the positive internal evidence, and the external objections, we're working on the final category, the internal objections, alleged contradictions between the Gospels. Our goals for this evening are to examine a list of 9 more alleged contradictions. We had a good double handful last month, and this month we're plowing forward with 9 more alleged contradictions among the Gospels, most of them dealing with the events surrounding Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And we don't just want to read these, ponder them, and nod. We want to assess the claim that these are actual and serious contradictions that should make us doubt the substantial historical trustworthiness of the Gospels. As I said last time, our goal here is not to prove that the scriptures are inerrant or to prove that they are inspired. It's to take specific examples raised by Christianity's critics and look at them with an historian's eyes and see how they look under the lens of dispassionate historical inquiry. We made a distinction last time between real contradictions and apparent contradictions, and that distinction is an important one for us to track again tonight. 2 claims contradict one another when one of them must be false if the other is true. In that case, at least one of the 2 claims must be mistaken. An apparent contradiction is a case where 2 claims apparently contradict one another. It seems that one of them must be false, maybe both. But sometimes seeming can be deceiving. And we saw examples of that last time from outside of the Bible, not just things inside the Bible, but outside as well. I made a list last time of 5 common sources of apparent contradiction, and I thought we would just review that briefly tonight. First, carelessness, interpreting a phrase or a sentence without regard to genre or narrative context. Arguably, that will come up tonight. Completeness, assuming that every account of an event includes every significant detail about it. That will be huge. Tonight we will see many examples of that. Conflation, treating 2 different events or persons as if they were the same. That would be an obvious problem. You take 2 different things, you treat them as the same, then you're likely to get discrepancies. Confusion, treating the same thing as if it were 2 different things. Once again, an easy way to get yourself tied up in knots. And finally, context, ignoring facts about language and the culture, or assuming that those are identical to the cultural context we share today. All of these are ways of misreading Scripture or any other historical document in a way that will give rise to conflict almost inevitably. Here's the charge that we'll be examining tonight, and I'm choosing here Professor Bart Ehrman, an apostate minister, used to be a Baptist minister, now considers himself an agnostic leaning unto atheism. He says the sources regarding Jesus' resurrection, and that's what we'll focus on tonight, though we'll do 1 or 2 other things, are hopelessly contradictory as we can see by doing a detailed comparison of the accounts in the Gospels. I could stand here and I could give you an example of that. In fact, a couple of months ago, I did just that at a men's breakfast for a church in Battle Creek. I said, let me play devil's advocate for you for a little while, and I started reeling off for them a list of objections to the Gospels and watched as the blood drained out of their faces, and they said, you made that sound really plausible. I said, yes, of course. But instead of my doing that, I'm going to let Bart Ehrman do it for me. So what I'm going to do now is play a video clip from a debate that Ehrman participated in 2 years ago. And I'm going to let him choose his own examples, put his best foot forward for the claim that the sources are hopelessly contradictory. I don't agree with him. That should go without saying. But let's let him make his case, and then we'll go through his points one by one. So here's Bart making his case.
There are small discrepancies between the Gospels, hundreds of them. Was Jairus' daughter sick but still alive when Jairus came to ask Jesus to heal her, as in Mark? Or did she just die before Jairus came, so that he asked Jesus to raise her from the dead, as in Matthew? Hard to see how it could be both ways. The Gospel of John says explicitly that Jesus died on the day of preparation for Passover, the afternoon before the Passover meal was eaten. The Gospel of Mark says explicitly that Jesus died the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. Don't take my word for it. Read John 19 and Mark 15 for yourself. They contradict each other. Or look at the resurrection accounts in the four Gospels sometime and ask yourself, how many women went to the empty tomb? What were their names? Was the stone rolled away before the women arrived or after they got there? What did they see there? One man, two men, or two angels? What were they told to do? To tell the disciples to go to Galilee or not? Did they tell the disciples or not? Did the disciples go to Galilee or not? It depends which gospel you read. You get a different story every time. We should not say that these are a bunch of details and don't affect the larger picture. The larger picture is made up of nothing but details. The big pictures are vastly different too, as you'll see once you allow yourself to admit that the details are all different up and down the line. In my opinion now, the accounts of the Gospels cannot be reliable because they differ in hundreds of ways, both big and small, and they contain numerous historical errors.
Well, there we go. Now you know what Bart Ehrman thinks. Let's make a list so that we don't miss anything. Number one, was Jairus' daughter already dead? Matthew chapter 9, verse 18 and following. Or just dying? Mark chapter 5, when he came to Jesus. Number two, did Jesus die on the day of preparation for Passover, which Bart claims is what we find in John 19, or on the day of Passover itself, as in Mark 15 and the other synoptic Gospels? Number three, how many women went to the tomb on Sunday morning? We have three different accounts of that from the synoptics, and then John chapter 20 as well. What were their names? Was the stone rolled away? What did they see? A man, two men, two angels. What were they told to do? To tell the disciples to go to Galilee or not? Did they tell the disciples or not? Did the disciples go or not? Well, Bart says it depends which gospel you read. And the insidious thing about it is that there's just enough truth in what he says here to make it plausible, and just enough error to make it wrong. Let's unpack these one at a time. Objection number one. We have two texts here that'll be the key things for us to compare. Matthew chapter 9, verse 18. A ruler came. He's not named in Matthew because Matthew's account is somewhat abbreviated vis-a-vis Mark's. A ruler came and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live." Flip to Mark chapter 5, parallel passage, and the story is very similar, slightly different. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So what's the apparent contradiction? According to Matthew, Jairus says that his daughter has just died. According to Mark, Jairus says that his daughter is at the point of death. Well, which way is it? There's a bit of an irony here, and I'll just pause to note it. According to Bart Ehrman, the only language Jesus ever spoke was Aramaic. Of course, our Gospels are written in Greek. And the Bibles we read today are translations from the Greek. So if Bart were right that Jesus never spoke anything but Aramaic, which would be a little bit odd because he does have a conversation with Pontius Pilate, who probably didn't study Aramaic, but let that pass. If Jesus spoke only Aramaic, then by Bart's own reasoning, what we've got here are Greek translations of whatever it was that Jairus said and whatever it was that Jesus said back to him in Aramaic. And we probably shouldn't rest too much weight on it. And in fact, in this case, this particular case, it's not at all implausible that they were speaking Aramaic. Jairus was a leader of the synagogue, a Jew, well-trained. Jesus was a Jew himself. They're up in Galilee. He's not down in a cosmopolitan area where he's talking with people who are coming from all over. It's not like conversing with Nicodemus, who's probably a Hellenized Jew and speaks Greek as his first language. So in this case, it may be true. But let's let that pass and let's look at what we've got. First of all, comparing Matthew and Mark. Matthew's account is shorter. In Mark's account, we find that Jairus comes, he makes his request, then they're interrupted as we get a different healing right in there. A woman comes who's got an issue of blood. She touches the fringe of Jesus' garments, one of the tassels probably hanging off of his garments, and she's not supposed to do that because she's ritually unclean in view of her infirmity, and so everybody's not supposed to touch anybody who's unclean. But Jesus heals her anyway. Then word comes, servants come from Jairus' house and they say, your daughter's dead, why bother the master any further? And Jesus then takes the initiative. He says, only believe, come on, let's go, and goes in, dismisses the paid mourners who are wailing and playing flutes for the mourning of her death, and they go in and he raises her from the dead. So in both accounts, the daughter is dead by the time Jesus gets there. The only question is, what's going on with Jairus? Now, there are two ways to look at this. According to several scholars, Stein and Blomberg and Witherington, who are perfectly good scholars, the usage that Matthew gives in just saying, my daughter is dead, would be a perfectly acceptable way of reporting the same thing that Mark was saying if you were compressing the story. By the standards of handling of narrative at the time, this wouldn't even be considered to be an error. In other words, if you had sort of pulled Matthew out of the grave and said to him, look what you did to us. You gave us a problem. Matthew would have said, what? I didn't mean that to be taken quite that way. I was just telling the story briefly, right? The girl's dead. Jesus goes. That's all I meant to say. That's possible, but there is an alternative resolution that I think maybe has a little bit more to be said for it. According to a fellow named Chadwick, Matthew's expression, has died even now, is so close in meaning to Mark's expression, which would literally mean at the point of death, that a person full of anxiety might come to Jesus and say, she's dead by now, she's dead even now, and mean exactly the same thing that we would express by saying she's at the point of death. He left his house, she was dying. She was not dying slowly, she was dying right then and right there. He left his house in search of Jesus, came to him. He's obviously in great anguish as he comes because he falls at Jesus' feet. You have to understand the contrast in both Matthew and Mark between this ruler of the people of the Jews, the ruler of the synagogue. He's got high social standing and he falls at Jesus' feet. Who's the other person Jesus is dealing with in the very same passage? A woman who is unclean and shouldn't even be touching other people. She has low social standing. And Jesus takes time for both of them. But according to Chadwick, someone who used that expression might well use it to mean, my daughter, I left my daughter, she's dying. Even now she's dead. And mean exactly what we read in Mark. So he realized she was in the process of dying. He probably feared the worst by the time he even got to Jesus. He may well have used words that expressed his fear that the worst had already come to pass. I think that works. I'm satisfied with that. But for a moment, let's just look at this coolly, like a secular historian would look at two documents. Suppose that you're dealing with two documents by a Roman historian, and you find two stories so similar, and there's a slight variation in the expression, although the main point of the event is the same in both documents. Do you know what a secular historian would do? Shrug and move on. We do this all the time. We do this with Josephus, who has different works, both written by him, dealing with some of the same events. And sometimes there are slight variations in the way that he tells the same stories, and we just, yeah, okay, no biggie, and we move on. So, although I think that this can be resolved cleanly and satisfactorily along the lines of Chadwick, even if we were to take the other way of looking at it, the substantial historical value of the document would not be impugned. And remember that it's Bart Ehrman's claim that they are vastly different, that there are huge problems. This doesn't qualify as a huge problem. In fact, I don't think it qualifies as a problem at all. Let's look at objection number 2, the day of the crucifixion. This would be a more interesting charge. Mark 14:12 says, "On the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples said to him, 'Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" So manifestly, Jesus is alive at this point, right? And then they go, the Last Supper follows. After the Last Supper, they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is apprehended in Gethsemane. He's taken over to the Jewish ruler's house by night. They have a fast trial to whip up some charge, and then in the morning they drag him before Pilate. Pilate at first doesn't want to allow him to be crucified, but eventually gives in, and Jesus is crucified. So the Passover feast, the Seder as it's called, that takes place the first night after sundown, that feast has already been celebrated. But now, John 19, this is the chapter to which Bart Ehrman refers us, describes the scene where Jesus is condemned to be crucified. So he's before Pilate. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. Well, that looks awkward. Let's push on it a little bit and find out what's going on. So the apparent contradiction is that in Mark, the Last Supper takes place on the first day of Passover. Jesus is arrested that night, crucified on the next day, the first day, as the Jews reckon, the day of Passover. According to Ehrman, though, John is telling us something different. He's telling us the crucifixion took place on the day of preparation for Passover, which would be, as Ehrman wants us to think, the day before the beginning of Passover. That would be a problem. But that's not what John says. What John says is not that it was the day of preparation for the Passover. He says that it was the day of preparation of Passover. You say, so what? What difference does that make? That seems like a semantic quibbling, but actually it makes a difference because Mark uses this same term, paraskue. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath. He tells you what the word preparation means. It doesn't mean preparation for the Passover. It means preparation for the Sabbath. In fact, it's always been the Greek word for Friday, because the Sabbath is Saturday. So preparation means day before Sabbath. And Mark, using exactly the same term, tells us that. But there's still the oddness that John has said, preparation of Passover. Still, John in chapter 19, a little further on, makes it perfectly plain that he's using this to mean the day before the Sabbath. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, And then there's this little parenthetical comment. For that Sabbath was a high day. We'll come back to that parenthesis. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. The Jews didn't want the bodies up there on the Sabbath day. So what does John mean when he says that was a high Sabbath day? He means, and in this I have the support of a number of commentators, that it was a particularly special feast day. Not just any Sabbath day, but Sabbath in Passover week. For an approximate parallel for us, and it's not really the same thing because we invest this with a great deal of special significance, but it gives you something of a feel of it. There are some Sundays that are just Sunday, right? You wake up, like, time to go to church, whatever, and you go. Now, I'm sure you're all much more enthusiastic than that, aren't you? And then there are things like Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday is not just any Sunday, it's a special Sunday. For the Jews, a Sabbath in Passover week was a special Sabbath, a high Sabbath, and that's what John is saying, and that's why he pauses to say it was the day of preparation of Passover. It was a Passover, get ready for Sabbath day. Second question, isn't there a problem here still? Bart doesn't raise this, but I'll raise it for him. Back a chapter earlier, John 18, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Hey, wait, Dr. McGrew, I thought you were saying that the Passover Seder had already taken place the previous night. What's this all about then? Aren't they saying, we want to eat the Passover meal? I'm so glad you asked that question. Passover isn't just one day. Passover is a week long. Throughout the Gospel of John, the word for Passover is used 9 times. This passage is one of them. There are 8 others. And in every single one of those uses, it doesn't mean the lamb, and it doesn't mean the evening meal that kicks it off. It means the whole feast. That supper, that Seder that begins Passover, Thursday is finished, sundown comes, the new day is counted as beginning at sundown. That meal is not the only ritual meal eaten during Passover. In fact, there's another one, the Chagiga, which is eaten in the middle of the day, the next day. Right? It's midday on Friday, there's another ritual meal. You say, okay, well, I guess that might be the meal. In fact, it has to be the meal, and here's why. Suppose that the chief priests, they're worried about entering Pilate's building because they don't want to be coming into contact with anything Gentile that might defile them. But suppose they had made contact with something Gentile that had defiled them. That defilement, by the Jews' own rules, expires at sundown with a simple washing. You wait for the sun to go down, you wash, you're good. You're no longer defiled. And since the Passover Seder, the meal that starts Passover, is an after sundown meal, that's the whole point. We've waited until the new day begins. There would be no problem. If they were worried about defilement for an evening meal, they were worried over nothing. All they have to do is wait for sundown and wash, and they're good to go. So they must be concerned about something else, not an evening meal. So John's account actually fits perfectly with Mark's. The concern of the chief priests is not and could not be about the Passover Seder. That wouldn't make any sense. The Seder was over, having been eaten the previous evening. They're concerned about some other meal in Passover, very probably the Chagiga, because it's on that morning that the Feast of Unleavened Bread gets started, and they have this special ritual meal there. All right. 2 down, 7 to go. Let's look at 3 and 4 together. How many women and who? Compare the passages. Mark 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. With 3 names. Matthew 28, verse 1. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. So we get two names there. Luke 24:10. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. Each account does give us something, or several of the accounts give us some names that the others don't. John 20 names only Mary Magdalene. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. You might wonder, is John suggesting that Mary was the only person who came? Because the other accounts do have multiple people, right? That much is clear. And if John were saying Mary's the only one, that would be odd. But let's read a little further in John. When she finds the tomb empty, she went to Simon Peter's and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Who's the we? John doesn't name the other people, but Mary's choice of words here reveals that there were more people than just her who came, and John's quotation of Mary shows that John knew this as well. This is not a case of John saying only one person came. So the appearance of contradiction arises only if we assume, quite unjustly, that each account is intended to be complete, giving us a comprehensive list of the women. Luke explicitly says that there were others besides those he names. John tacitly shows that he knows there were others besides Mary. So we get a contradiction only if we force upon the narrative something that isn't even there in any account, namely the extra claim, "and nobody else." But that's not a very fair way to read any document, religious or not. Objection number 5, the stone. In Matthew's account, we have that passage about the women coming to the tomb. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow, and for fear of him the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid." And then the story goes on the way that we normally remember it. Mark and Luke are much terser on this. Mark 16, "And they were saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?' And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large." Luke just says, "And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb." Even terser. No mention of the angel, no mention of the guards falling like dead men, or even of the guards being there at all. And as they come, the stone is already rolled away. So what are we to make of this? Ehrman tells us Matthew intends us to understand, sorry for the typo there, that the women were witnesses to the descent of the angel and the rolling away of the stone. But Mark and Luke clearly state that it had been rolled away already when they arrived. So the key question is, does Matthew intend us to understand that the women witnessed the descent of the angel, the rolling of the stone, and all of that? Because if so, that does contradict what Mark and Luke tell us, which is they arrived to find that the stone had already been moved. But the entire passage regarding the angel, verses 2 through 4 of Matthew 28, is introduced by the Greek particle gar. It just means for, and it usually indicates an explanation of something. Its purpose is to explain the earthquake and the state of affairs as the women found it. Further, if you wanted to go there, Matthew uses an aorist participle, which could be, and in some versions is translated with what we call the past perfect, or if you're really a grammatical nut, the pluperfect. For an angel of the Lord had descended. Now, that's a choice that we make with an aorist verb or a participle based on a verb only when the context, the sense of the context seems to demand it. And it would be legitimate here, but not forced absolutely upon us. But either of these considerations, either the consideration of the introduction by the connecting particle gar, or the consideration of the flexibility and the understanding of the aorist would suffice to remove the appearance of contradiction. Matthew's telling us how it came to be that the women who were not capable of rolling away the stone got there and found that they could see inside the tomb. This is what had happened. So to force that into the suggestion that they actually witnessed the angel descending and the guards being stunned is to say more than Matthew says, and I think more than Matthew intended to say. I think Matthew would have been quite surprised to hear anybody try to read it that way. But you have to read it that way in order to generate the appearance of a contradiction here. But let's press the objection a little bit. Maybe that's too easy of a solution. Maybe we should let a skeptic push a little bit harder. How did Matthew know about the descent of the angel at all if the women didn't see it? He clearly knows what the women saw, right? They came back, they gave testimony, he's writing down about that. But if they didn't see the angel, how does Matthew know about it? We could say he's directly inspired by God to know about it. For obvious reasons, though, that would sound like we were making an excuse, but there's a much simpler answer at hand. He already has information about the guards. Right? Reading on in Matthew 28, there's a lot of stuff crammed into Matthew 28. It ends kind of with a bunch of things jumbled up together real fast. Matthew had other sources of information about the guards. They go, they tell everything to the Jewish rulers. The Jewish rulers say, well, okay, why don't you say that his disciples came and stole the body while you slept, and we'll give you some money to tell this story, and if anybody tries to give you trouble about it, we'll take care of it and you won't have any problems. And that's the story, Matthew says, that's told among the Jews to this very day. So Matthew obviously knows more about what the soldiers said. If he's got that source of information, we don't need to look anywhere else for a source of information about what was going on with the guards or with the angel. It was part of the guard's story. How about objection number 6? Man or angel, one or two. Here we go. Mark chapter 16, verses 5 and 6. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, and then the story goes on. Matthew 28 tells us, but the angel said to the women. So now, is it a man or is it an angel? Luke 24 says, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. John 20 says, Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels. So 1 man, 1 angel, 2 men, 2 angels. Which way is it? Looks like it could be a contradiction. Let's push on this a little bit. This is not what an angel looks like. You will notice in this lovely stained glass window the appearance of wings on the back of the angel. That is a wonderful medieval motif. But when angels come as messengers of God on earth, they appear as men. Think back to Genesis 18. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 beings with wings on their back? No, 3 men were standing in front of him. That's how angels appear. Otherwise, why would it say in Hebrews 13:2 that we shouldn't neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares? How could you be unaware of it if they were carrying a parasail on their back? It would be kind of a dead giveaway, but that's not the way it works. So, with this consideration, part of the objection is answered. Mark and Luke give a description of what the women saw. Matthew and John give an interpretation, maybe the women's own interpretation, of what they saw. Now, there's no contradiction between the description, men, and the interpretation, angels, any more than there is in Genesis 18. But that's only part of the objection. The other part is, what about the 1 versus the 2? I think this is very easily dealt with. Matthew and Mark focus on the one who spoke, and they don't mention the other. To omit something is not the same thing as denial. I had an example of this myself in something I was myself saying about a month ago to my wife. I had met a couple of people, and I was telling her about it, and I found myself in the course of telling the story saying, so I met this guy, and we talked about this, and we talked about that. Of course, I had actually met two people, and I had even spoken with both of them, but the bulk of the conversation was with one of them. And so as I was telling it myself spontaneously, not trying to mimic the Gospels, I found myself telling it as I met this person, and this is what he said, and this is what we talked about. It's a very natural manner of speech. To mention one is not the same thing as to say there was only one. That would be reading into the document something that is not there. I'll just add parenthetically here, the scene with Mary Magdalene in John 20 occurs later. Mary appears to have been in the lead of the party of women as they came to the tomb. As soon as she sees the stone rolled away, she goes tearing back into Jerusalem to the residence of John, where John and Peter are lodged, possibly separate from the rest of the disciples. The other women stay at the tomb, and they encounter the angel. Mary just took off and didn't see that. Peter and John go running. Mary's winded from having run there. They arrive after that company of women has left. They look in. They see the tomb is empty. They see the clothes lying. They leave. Mary comes along behind, and that's when this scene in John 20 takes place. So this is actually a different scene, but no big deal in any event. How about objection number 7? What were they told? Well, let's look at Matthew 28, verse 7. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you. Mark 16, verse 7, but go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So he's going before them to Galilee. He's promised to go before them to Galilee, although they didn't quite figure out what he was talking about. Back in Matthew 26, he said, but after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. And they probably just, like the disciples typically were a little dense and said, after he's raised up. Okay, whatever that means. Jesus was always saying things full of meaning, and they were, what does he say to them when he appears to them after his resurrection in the upper room? What does he say to them on the road to Emmaus? He upbraids them for not understanding. He says, y'all are so slow. I can't believe how you failed to get the point. So Matthew and Mark record the reminder Jesus gave them. And then they follow it up with an instruction to go to Galilee. Matthew and John both report post-resurrection appearances of Jesus in Galilee. And now we get to the interesting part. Luke just doesn't include that. It's another omission. But once again, we cannot take omissions to be the same thing as denials. None of the great historians of ancient Greece, like Herodotus, mention Rome. Rome, young warlike power, master of the Italian peninsula just across the Adriatic Sea from Greece. They just don't mention that it exists. What? You forgot? What, like trying to write a political history of the United States through the 60s and forgetting about Russia? But they don't. For whatever reason, they just don't mention it. Does that mean they positively believe there was no such thing as Rome? No. Ulysses Grant talks about the Civil War meticulously in detail. He's got 2 volumes of memoirs. Just happens to omit the Emancipation Proclamation. Does that mean he didn't think it happened? No. For whatever reason, it just didn't make it in there. Marco Polo talks about his travels across China. He omits the Great Wall of China. He omits printed books. He omits foot binding. He omits tea, although he traveled through the tea districts. Does that mean that these things weren't real at that time? No. It just means you can't take an author's omitting things to be the same thing as his claiming outright that they didn't happen, didn't exist, and so forth. So here's Luke, not claiming that Jesus didn't go into Galilee, not claiming that the women weren't told that, but simply not mentioning that. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise." And they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. So let's do a chart of what the Synoptics report and omit. In Mark, we've got a reminder of Jesus' words. In Matthew, we've got a reminder of Jesus' words. In Luke, we've got a reminder of part of that, a partial reminder, but not of the whole thing. In Mark, we've got instruction to go to Galilee. In Matthew, we've got instruction to go to Galilee. Luke leaves that out. In Matthew, we've got subsequent appearance in Galilee. Neither in Mark nor in Luke do we find that, at least not if Mark ends, as we'll discuss in a moment, at chapter 16, verse 8. In Luke, we've got two things reported in neither of the other synoptic gospels. We have appearances in Jerusalem, and we have Jesus' ascension. This is chronicled for us actually twice by Luke. So, how should we explain this? First thing, most scholars think that Mark, as we've got it, ends at Mark 16, verse 8. You say, but there are 20 verses in my Bible in the 16th chapter of Mark. The remaining 12 verses are found in some later manuscripts, but not in the earlier manuscripts. And they're thought to have been added precisely because, looking at Mark 16 ending at verse 8, you have a very distinct feeling this is incomplete. This is not filled out. We haven't got everything that we would very naturally want to know. It appears that we've lost the original ending of Mark, and someone came along, probably someone in the first century, not intending to forge anything, but just intending to fill out the account, and filled in the remainder, perhaps from oral tradition at that time. Matthew, but notice what that tells us about Mark. From the fact that we don't have anything further in Mark, we can't infer that Mark was denying it, that he didn't know about it. We can't make any inferences because we don't have whatever it was that he wrote to fill out the end of it. Matthew, having recorded Jesus' promise to meet his followers in Galilee, has to include both the instruction to meet them and the appearance there. Jesus made a promise. Matthew records the fulfillment of that promise and the word to them that they'll see him again in Galilee so that they're reminded of that. So Matthew ties that together. Matthew's gospel terminates kind of abruptly. You get the feeling as you're reading through the crucifixion narrative, he's got plenty of space. He's writing and he's writing and he's writing and he's giving us a lot of details. Sometimes you look at the details and you say, wow, why do we even have these details? Are they as important as other things he could have told us? And then comes chapter 28, and suddenly Matthew's got about 5 things he wants to do all in rapid succession. So he takes maybe 4 or 5 verses apiece for little chunks of things. Tells you about the women coming to the tomb. Tells you about the guards going and telling the Jewish rulers what had happened. Just little chunks like that. He's got to tell you about the appearance of Jesus before the large group. Probably this is the 500 that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15. But he's telescoping a lot into a very small space. Why? I have a conjecture, and I can't say that we can say this for certain, but it's plausible. Matthew's gospel, like Luke's gospel, is about the length that you could fit onto one standard-sized scroll with normal-sized handwriting. And curiously enough, in the work of the first century Jewish historian Josephus, we have an example of what could happen when you were trying to write on scrolls. Josephus is writing along a work against Appian, and he's towards the end of his first book of this, and suddenly he just says, but I'll write more about this, but I'm running out of scroll. And then the work picks up again, so you know there must have been another scroll, and you get a second volume to it. The conjecture, which I find plausible but can't prove, is that Matthew was writing along, taking his time, filling in everything that he could, that he remembered, that he thought would be interesting to his readers, and then he sort of rolled out a little bit more of the scroll, and that was it. It just ended there, and he said, oh, I got to finish this pretty quickly, and so he crammed the rest of it into a limited amount of space. Conjecture, not sure it's true, but it's not without precedent in the secular literature, as the case of Josephus shows us. Like Matthew, Luke likely filled one scroll with his gospel, and he compressed a lot of events in that final chapter. Read Luke 24. You've got the description of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and that's wonderful, and he's taking his time, and he's laying that out, and he tells you how Jesus said, oh, slow of heart to believe all the prophets have foretold, and then he opened the scriptures to them, and he goes to their place, and they make him stay with them, and then he breaks the bread, and they suddenly realize it's the Lord. And then he disappears, and they run back to Jerusalem. And then everything, once they get back to Jerusalem, everything's kind of telescoped together again. There are too many events. You can sit down and make a list of them sometime. There are too many things there plausibly to have happened all on one day, and Luke never says they did. But he doesn't give you a real clear sense of the timeline. He marches through some things that Jesus said to them, and he gets you to the ascension. But you see, Luke doesn't have to worry too much about it because he's got another document to write. He writes volume 2, the book of Acts. And at the beginning of it, he takes a few verses and spreads it out, and he tells you a little bit more about the timeline. He tells you that there were 40 days during which Jesus was with them and when the ascension took place. So he has volume 2 in which to fill it out a little bit more freely. But let's press the objection again. Let's not just let this go too easily. Why does Luke leave out the appearances in Galilee? We don't know for sure, but if he's running out of scroll, that would be a reasonable explanation. There's something more, though. Do you remember how Luke's gospel opens? There's a little preface to his correspondent, Theophilus. And he says, since many have undertaken to write an account of all the things that have happened among us, and then he goes through and describes that many have done this and that he made diligent inquiry, and it seemed good to him also to write all these things up in order. He's using sources. Now, when you're writing something for an audience, you want to be interested in it, and you've got, let's suppose, for the sake of the argument, which I consider to be plausible, that Luke had some kind of access to the Gospel of Mark as he was writing his Gospel. What are your readers going to be most interested in? You're copying out pretty much what was said in Mark in more or less the same words? That's nice, but we already had the Gospel of Mark. They're going to be more interested in the stuff that you don't have in Mark. And so Luke emphasizes source material he's got on stuff that's not found in Mark. John does this on an epic scale. John seems to have written his gospel deliberately in order to fill in all of the things that he was thinking of that weren't the same things that were already told in the other gospels. Compare them side by side sometime. If you saw 3 sets of footprints in the snow and they were all running along, crisscrossing one another, you'd say this is 3 people walking together. That's like the Synoptics. They make little side trails here and there. They have some independent information, but they're basically moving along the same trail. Suppose you saw a 4th set of footprints, and they were over along the margin of the woods. And they generally stayed away from the main trail, but when they did come up to the main trail, this person had actually made a careful move to put his own footprints in between the footprints of the others, so he never quite stepped in theirs. What would you say? You would say that was done deliberately. This person was trying not just to take the same path as and walk in the same steps as these other people. That's what John looks like. So we have a little taste of that here at the end of Luke, I think, where he's trying to stress material not found in other readily available sources. But again, Luke never claims that he is saying everything that Jesus said or did. Objection number 8. Did they tell the disciples? Mark 16, verse 8. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That makes sense. Now, it was Mary Magdalene, says Luke, and Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and the other women who were with them, who told these things to the apostles, but these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. So here's the apparent contradiction. According to Luke, they went and told the disciples what they had seen and heard, but Ehrman insinuates that according to Mark, they said nothing to anyone. And those words, said nothing to anyone, do appear in Mark. So what's going on there? Well, because Mark's gospel apparently is abruptly torn off at that point, we can only conjecture how it ended. But the most plausible reading of the phrase said nothing to anyone is that the women didn't run screaming into Jerusalem and tell everything to the first male they met. Instead, they ran straight to the disciples without telling anyone else. And if that's how it had continued, nobody would bat an eye at it. And at this point, maybe you're saying, you know, Dr. McGrew, that sounds like you're making an excuse. I don't know if I should take Mark that way. Hey, let's have a look at how Mark uses language elsewhere in his gospel, shall we? Mark 5:37, and he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John. Mark 9, verse 8, and suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only. Mark 10:18, Jesus said to him, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. Do you see a pattern here? Mark routinely uses sweeping negative statements and then comes in and qualifies them. That's his style. That's typical of the way that he writes. There is nothing outrageous about the suggestion that in Mark 16:8, his saying they told no one for they were afraid would be followed by his saying that they went and told the disciples. That would be completely in keeping with Mark's own style of writing. So we don't have to make this up. We can look in Mark and see it there for ourselves. How about objection number 9? Did the disciples go to Galilee? Matthew and John report that they did. Mark breaks off before that would be reported. Luke doesn't mention it. But he doesn't say that they didn't, and he doesn't claim to be giving a complete account of all that Jesus did after his resurrection. In fact, in Luke volume 2, which we call Acts, look at what he says in Acts 1:3. He presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. Give us more details, Luke. But he doesn't. That's all he says. But he knows full well that there are a lot more things that happened there than happened to be recorded in his brief telescope narrative of events at the end of his gospel. So let's go one by one. Bart Ehrman said, read the Gospels and ask yourself these questions. Let's ask ourselves his questions and let's answer them. Question number 1. Was Jairus' daughter sick but still alive when Jairus came to ask Jesus to heal her, as in Mark? Or did she just die before Jairus came so that he asked Jesus to raise her from the dead, as in Matthew? The answer is, his daughter was dying. She was on the point of death when he came to Jesus. He may well have feared that the worst had happened by the time that he got there, that she was already dead. If Matthew's language is not simply a terse summary of the kind that would be acceptable use of material by first century standards, then it may reflect his fear that, in fact, she had already died. All of the accounts concur that she was dead by the time that Jesus got there. All of them concur that he had the faith to follow Jesus up into the room, even after she had died. Question number 2. The Gospel of John says explicitly that Jesus died on the day of preparation for the Passover, the afternoon before the Passover meal was eaten. And you remember what Bart said? Don't take my word for it. Read John chapter 19 and Mark chapter 15 for yourself. Well, thank you, Bart. We won't take your word for it. We will read them. for ourselves. And then we discover, no, it doesn't. John does not say that Jesus died on the day of preparation for the Passover. It says he died on the day of preparation of Passover, that is, the day before the high Sabbath in Passover. Details in John's text show that he has the same timeline in mind as the authors of the Synoptic Gospels. That would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus died on a Friday afternoon on the first day of the Passover festival, the afternoon after the evening meal the previous evening that had commenced the feast. Bart asks, how many women went to the empty tomb? What were their names? We don't know exactly how many women went to the tomb, but that does not tell us that there was no number of women who went to the tomb, or that nobody went to the tomb, or that everybody is just making up the story. There were at least 5, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, Salome, and at least one more unnamed woman, perhaps several others, according to Luke 24:10. That's what we're entitled to say. There's nothing wrong with saying that. Bart might say, but you're putting together the accounts of the Gospels. Yeah, we are. We do that with all history. Anytime we're lucky enough to have multiply attested witnesses to the same event, we get multiple attestation, we always look for ways to put the documents together. That's not some special thing that only Christians do. This is just good intellectual procedure. This is how history gets done. Was the stone rolled away before the women arrived or after they got there? The stone was rolled away before they arrived. Matthew's account in 28, verses 2 through 4, gives an explanation for what they found when they did arrive. The guards apparently gone, the stone rolled away, not a description of events that unfolded before their eyes. What did they see there? 1 man, 2 men, or 2 angels? They saw 2 angels, in appearance like young men, one of whom spoke and was therefore the only one mentioned in Matthew and Mark. What were they told to do? To tell the disciples to go to Galilee or not? They were told to tell the disciples that Jesus would go before them into Galilee, a fulfillment of his promise before his death. They were not told that this would be the first time they would see Jesus. None of the Gospels says that they were to go to Galilee right away. This is what we're told. Some omit that. Omission is not denial. Did they tell the disciples or not? Yes. The attempt to press the abrupt termination of Mark into service as an argument against this is, frankly, disingenuous. Did the disciples go to Galilee or not? Yes. Although Mark is broken off before the place where we would expect a description of it, and Luke doesn't mention it, both Matthew and John describe different scenes in which Jesus appears to his disciples in Galilee. And then Ehrman gives us a parting shot. He says, we should not say that these are a bunch of details and don't affect the larger picture. The larger picture is made up of nothing but details. The big pictures are vastly different too, as you'll see once you allow yourself to admit that the details are all different up and down the line. Do you see what's wrong with this line of reasoning? Here's a picture. Nice bit of modern realistic painting. I believe this one is by Buchner. You can see the boat in the foreground. You can see the water's lapping edge there up against the sand. You see the post, and you see the little village dimly across the lake with the backdrop of mountains. Nice picture. I like realistic art. Here's another picture. There's a boat in the foreground, there's a post, you see the shoreline in the water, you see a little village against the mountains in the background. These are different pictures. They're by different artists. They are the same scene. They're drawn from the same scene. And for somebody to say, for a clever modern philosopher to come along and say, the picture is nothing but the individual brushstrokes, and the brushstrokes are different all up and down the line. There are no 2 brushstrokes that are identical between those pictures. Therefore, they're not pictures of the same scene. Would be to provoke laughter, right? Nobody would take this seriously. Nobody would say, oh, yeah, you're right. There are no 2 dots of paint, or in my electronic representation, no 2 pixels that are in the same location, are exactly the same color. Therefore, they just can't be pictures of the same scene. No, that just doesn't follow. Barth is attempting to confuse us by pretending, first of all, that the details are actually contradictory, and then that when the details differ at all, there can be no such thing as the common content of the pictures. That's just not true. Briefly, and for the benefit of those of you who have made it through many, perhaps all of these lectures, let's just review what we've discovered over the course of all of these lectures. First of all, from lecture number 1, there is strong external and internal evidence for the traditional authorship of the Gospels, that they were written by these guys, Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. In lectures 2 and 3, we saw that there is strong external and internal evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels and Acts. If you missed one of those, they're up on YouTube. Go, watch. We've seen that the most commonly claimed historical errors in the Gospels turn out on examination not to be errors at all. We spent 2 lectures, I called them 4A and 4B, going over exactly that. And finally, last month and tonight, we've seen that the most commonly alleged contradictions in the Gospels turn out on examination not to be contradictions at all. I'll just wind up with a quotation from the Gospel of John. Since the incompleteness of our various accounts has been a source for so many of Ehrman's objections, I think that it's worth our being reminded that the authors of the Gospels were fully aware that they were writing incomplete accounts. John says, now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Thank you. Questions? So the question is, are there places where the Synoptics might leave us a little puzzled or wanting some information, and then John comes along and supplies it, in addition to the fact that in John chapter 21, he's got appearances to the disciples in Galilee? And the answer is yes, in a number of places. There are, I'm thinking of undesigned coincidences, there are several of these in connection with the feeding of the 5,000, and we went over some of these in the internal evidences talk where, for example, Mark 6:31, in the setup for the feeding of the 5,000, tells us that there were many coming and going and they had no leisure even to eat, and so Jesus said, well, come apart to a deserted place. And then in verse 39 of the same chapter, Jesus is about to feed the multitude, and he has them sit down on the green grass, but grass usually isn't green in Palestine. Most of the year round it's brown. And then over in John chapter 6, set up for the same scene, we find that John just drops in the detail, the Passover was at hand. Well, the Passover being at hand would explain both of these things. It would explain why there were throngs on roads that would lead to Jerusalem, because that was an enormously popular feast. Josephus says millions of people came every year. And it would explain why the grass was green, because Passover is smack in the middle of the 1 month growing season for the grass over there. And that's just when it would be green. So, yeah, John supplies that. But John also supplies things very interesting. Consider Luke's account, I think this is in Luke 22, of the Last Supper. Luke says there that Jesus tells the disciples, I am among you as one who serves. It's just after supper. You're reading around in the rest of that chapter of Luke, and you don't see it. You don't get it. Is Jesus just referring to a general attitude of humility, that he was kind of a humble guy? Or, well, I don't know. I mean, this is the guy who just chased money changers out of the temple. What's the deal with that? But go to John 13, and you see that Jesus was referring to something he had just done then. He had risen from dinner, laid aside his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, and washed their feet. That's a servant's job. Now we understand what Luke is referring to. But Luke explains why Jesus did that. In John, as you're reading John 13, Okay, Jesus loved them a lot, and he did this for them, and that's cool, but why? Go a little bit further back in Luke 22, and you'll discover that on the way there, they were bickering among themselves about who was going to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So what does Jesus do? He gives them an object lesson in humility, the very thing they need right there. So John and Luke intersect beautifully there with the feeding of the 5,000. We have John and Mark intersecting. There are other connections crisscrossing these. When I did the Undesigned Coincidences talk, I only had time to do a limited number. I was telling John, I did maybe a dozen. I have about 50 more for you. But you don't all want to sit here and hear them all, so I won't do them. Any more questions? Yes?
Talk more about the rest of that debate.
You want to know a little bit more about the debate from which the video clip comes. That was a debate between Craig Evans, who is a professor at Acadia Divinity School, I believe. Just a wonderfully erudite man, very intimately familiar with the Jewish backdrop, has read all of the Jewish literature that gives us the framework for understanding the Jewishness of the Gospels and how Jesus is interacting with aspects of the Jewish tradition which we can't pick up without reading back into that literature. And Ehrman, in my view, largely engaged in what I would call pettifogging. That is, his debate strategy was to raise dozens of little problems as though he were releasing a dozen mosquitoes, and then leave Evans to try to just swat them all in the course of the debate, which is very difficult to do, of course, because in a timed debate, you have only a certain amount of time, and then you're cut off by the moderator. And so if you allow your opponent to set the agenda by saying, well, I've got a bunch of objections. It depends on which gospel you read, this and that and the other thing, and lay them all out. And then you, abandoning whatever preparation you had done, go around and try to answer all of the objections. You look disorganized. It's very difficult to find them all, and it's really hard to do on your feet. So what Evans did instead was he presented a more general case for the historical reliability of the Gospels, understanding them within the context of their time, not trying to impose standards of Kate Kennedy accuracy, are these the exact words in the exact order in which, but understanding that, for example, perfectly acceptable way for a disciple to present the teaching of his master was for him to be like his master right there before you, preaching it all over again. And that might involve making use of some aspects of the scene in which he's presenting it that weren't there when it was originally said, but that was completely acceptable use. That was understood at the time to be faithful preaching. And that gets us away from the idea that every word has to be verbatim in the exact order in which they're presented here, and to understand that it's the content that matters, like the two paintings that I had up there. Unfortunately, what that meant was that in presenting some very reasonable comments of that kind, Evans did not have the chance to go back and go one by one through Ehrman's complaints. And so what I did here is I gave you most of them. There were a couple at the beginning which I had already dealt with in previous lectures, but I gave you all the ones I haven't said anything about tonight. And then I did what Evans didn't really have the time or the appropriate opportunity to do, which is take them one by one and just go right down the list. So you can find the debate on YouTube, and what I've just given you is a thumbnail sketch of what was really an interesting debate, but this material is not borrowing from much of what Evans said, although he said many interesting things.